Every major tournament brings a wave of first-time visitors who show up with a rough idea of what to expect, and this World Cup was no different. Millions of fans landed in the United States over the past month carrying the same handful of assumptions. Loud, oversized, a little rough around the edges, maybe not the friendliest host nation on paper. What actually happened once they walked out of the airport didn't match that picture at all, and it didn't match it in ways that were specific enough and repeated often enough across completely unrelated travelers that it became one of the bigger side stories of the entire tournament. Before we get into what actually surprised them, go ahead and subscribe now if this kind of honest, on-the-ground travel breakdown is something you enjoy, since we're covering a lot more of these reactions in the coming weeks. The very first surprise usually happened before fans had even left the airport. Immigration officers, typically the least friendly part of any international arrival, were repeatedly described as relaxed, welcoming, and even a little playful with visiting fans, cracking jokes about the match schedule or asking who people were rooting for while stamping passports. That set an unexpected tone for what followed. Local volunteers stationed around host cities were consistently praised for going well beyond basic directions. Several described walking a lost group of fans several blocks out of their way just to make sure they found the right stadium entrance, rather than simply pointing and moving on to the next person in line. Small interactions kept adding up in a similar direction, a cashier holding a slightly longer conversation than necessary, a stranger offering directions before being asked, a bartender comping around for a table of visiting fans just to welcome them to the city. None of these moments were part of any official tournament hospitality program. They were just ordinary Americans going about their day and choosing to be a little more generous with their time than these visitors were used to back home. For fans arriving from countries where interactions with strangers tend to stay brief and transactional, that consistent warmth became one of the very first things they mentioned in their travel videos, often within the first few minutes of landing. A handful of specific stories kept resurfacing across completely separate accounts throughout the tournament. A hotel front desk upgrading a group of tired fans to a nicer room without being asked. A rideshare driver pointing out a shortcut to a better viewing spot near the stadium instead of just dropping passengers at the official entrance. A restaurant owner sending out an extra round of appetizers on the house once he heard which country a table of visitors had flown in from. None of these were treated as unusual exceptions in the retelling, more as a pattern that kept showing up in slightly different forms depending on the city. A few fans specifically compared the experience to previous tournaments they'd attended elsewhere, noting that the level of unprompted friendliness felt noticeably higher here than what they remembered from hosting nations in other parts of the world, even accounting for the natural excitement that comes with any major tournament. That comparison carried some weight since it wasn't coming from first-time international travelers with nothing to measure the experience against, but from fans who had specifically attended multiple World Cups and had a genuine basis for comparison. Once fans actually made it inside the venues, the scale of American stadium infrastructure became the next major talking point. A number of the host stadiums used for this tournament were built or heavily renovated specifically with massive video boards, some stretching the length of an entire end zone, delivering a level of in-stadium production that a lot of European fans, even those used to major club football, said outpaced anything they'd experienced at home. Concourse space was another repeated comparison point, with several fans specifically noting how much easier it was to move around during halftime or before kickoff, compared to the more cramped concourses common in a lot of older European stadiums, some of which were originally built decades before modern crowd sizes and amenities were part of the design conversation. Pre-game entertainment leaned heavily into spectacle, flyovers, elaborate pyrotechnics, and in a few host cities, live animal displays like trained birds of prey circling the pitch before kickoff, something that drew a mix of amusement and genuine astonishment from fans more used to a simpler walkout and anthem. Concession variety inside the stadiums surprised plenty of visitors as well, with food options going well beyond the usual stadium staples back home. Regional specialties specific to each host city showing up on the menu alongside the standard hot dogs and beer. None of this made the actual football better or worse. The sport itself stayed the same regardless of which country was hosting it, but the surrounding experience, the show built around the 90 minutes, was consistently described as bigger and more polished than what a lot of these fans had expected walking in. A number of stadiums also incorporated fan zones directly into the surrounding grounds, with live music, food trucks representing multiple countries, and interactive activities set up well before the gates even opened, turning a simple match day into something closer to a full afternoon event rather than a quick walk-in, watch, and leave experience. Accessibility upgrades made specifically for this tournament drew praise from fans traveling with family members who needed accommodations, with several stadiums rolling out expanded seating options and improved sightlines that a few visitors said outpaced what they'd experienced at similar venues back home. Security processes, often a source of frustration at major international events, were repeatedly described as faster and less invasive than expected, with several fans specifically noting shorter entry lines than they'd braced themselves for based on previous tournament experiences elsewhere. Even the walk from parking areas or transit stops into the stadium itself became part of the show in some host cities, with organized fan marches, drum lines, and street performers turning the approach to the venue into an experience of its own rather than just a logistical stretch to get through before the match actually started. With matches spread out across the schedule, most fans had significant time between games to actually explore the host cities themselves, and that unstructured time ended up shaping a lot of the broader impressions that came out of this tournament. Several fans described spontaneously extending stays in cities they'd only planned to pass through briefly, specifically because they found more to do than expected once they started exploring beyond the immediate stadium area. Public transit varied considerably by city, and that variation became its own talking point, with fans praising newer systems in cities that had invested heavily in transit ahead of the tournament, while being more critical of older, more limited systems in cities where getting around without a car proved genuinely difficult. Nightlife left a strong impression in several host cities, with fans describing bar and restaurant districts that stayed lively well past midnight, packed with a mix of local residents and visiting fans from a dozen different countries, all sharing the same space without any of the friction some had expected, given how politically charged international relations can sometimes get. A number of local businesses reported unusually strong sales throughout the tournament, with several bars and restaurants near host stadiums specifically crediting international visitors for some of their busiest weeks on record. That kind of extended, unstructured exposure to a city, rather than just a quick stadium visit and a flight back out, is part of why so many of these fans came away with such a detailed, specific set of impressions rather than a vague, surface-level review of the trip. Museums and cultural attractions in several host cities reported a noticeable bump in international visitors during tournament weeks, with a handful specifically crediting World Cup-related foot traffic for some of their strongest attendance numbers outside of a typical holiday season. Neighborhood-specific experiences became a particular highlight for fans who ventured beyond the most obvious tourist areas, with several describing smaller, locally run restaurants and bars that ended up being more memorable than anything on a typical visitor's guide, often found through a recommendation from a local rather than any official tournament material. A few fans also noted how differently each host city felt from the next, pointing out that lumping the entire country into one single impression didn't really hold up once they'd actually spent meaningful time in several distinct cities with their own separate character, architecture, and pace of life. That variety, moving from a dense East Coast city to a sprawling southern metro area to a completely different feel out west, ended up being one of the more underappreciated parts of the trip for fans who'd expected a more uniform experience across the country. Food kept coming up as one of the most repeated categories of surprise across the entire tournament, largely because expectations going in were set so low. Most fans arrived assuming American food meant fast food and little else, an assumption shaped by decades of stereotypes about grease and portion size rather than any real familiarity with regional American cooking. What they actually found varied enormously depending on which host city they were in. Texas barbecue smoked low and slow for the better part of a day, Southern comfort food built around biscuits, gravy, and fried chicken, and fast food chains specific to certain regions of the country that a lot of European visitors had only ever heard about through internet culture before finally trying them in person. Portion sizes remained genuinely larger than most visitors were used to, a fairly consistent talking point throughout the tournament, but the actual quality of ingredients in a lot of these regional dishes surprised people who'd assumed bigger automatically meant lower quality. Ranch dressing became something of a running joke across social media during the tournament, an American condiment that a lot of visitors dismissed on arrival and then found themselves ordering with nearly everything by the time they left. None of this makes American cuisine objectively better than what these fans grew up eating. European cooking has its own deep traditions that America doesn't really replicate either. But for visitors expecting bland and finding regionally distinct, well-made food instead, it became one more assumption that simply didn't hold up once they actually started eating their way through the tournament. Food trucks parked near fan zones added another layer to the experience, giving visitors access to a much wider range of cuisines in a single afternoon than a typical sit-down itinerary would have allowed. Korean barbecue parked next to a Louisiana-style crawfish stand, next to a straightforward burger truck, all within the same block. A number of fans specifically called out the diversity of options as something that caught them off guard, having assumed American food culture would be far more uniform across different cities than it actually turned out to be. Late-night eating culture became its own small talking point, with several visitors describing 24-hour diners and drive-thrus as a genuinely novel experience compared to the far more limited late-night food options available in most European cities once regular closing hours pass. A few fans also pointed out the sheer speed of American fast food service compared to what they were used to, describing orders arriving within minutes even during peak crowds around match times, something they credited to both staffing levels and a kitchen system clearly built to handle high volume without slowing down. Safety turned out to be the single biggest gap between expectation and reality across the entire tournament. A significant share of visiting fans arrived having absorbed years of international news coverage focused heavily on American crime statistics, and more than a few admitted packing and planning as though they were heading somewhere genuinely dangerous. What they actually experienced moving through host city downtowns, stadium districts, and tourist areas was considerably calmer than that mental image: women walking alone at night without incident, unlocked vehicles left overnight untouched, and a general sense of ease in public spaces that didn't match the tension a lot of visitors had braced themselves for. It's worth being accurate about this rather than overstating it. Crime in the United States varies enormously by city and even by specific neighborhood within the same city, and a tourist moving through a well-maintained downtown core or stadium district is having a genuinely different experience than someone in a struggling part of the same metro area a short distance away. International news coverage, both in Europe and elsewhere, tends to lean on the most dramatic American stories because those are the ones that travel and generate attention, while the far more ordinary experience of an average Tuesday night in a mid-sized American city rarely makes it into a headline anywhere. Even accounting for that nuance, the gap between what these fans expected and what they actually lived through during a month of moving through American cities was wide enough that it became one of the most repeated talking points of the entire tournament, showing up across dozens of separate, completely unconnected accounts. A few fans specifically credited increased police presence and dedicated tournament security around stadium districts for part of that sense of calm, acknowledging that the specific areas they were spending most of their time in had received extra attention precisely because of the event taking place there. Others pointed to something less tied to the tournament itself, describing a general sense of order in public spaces, functioning streetlights, well-maintained sidewalks, visible but low-key police presence, that didn't match the more chaotic image some had built up from news coverage focused on isolated incidents rather than typical daily conditions. Late-night transit use became a specific point of comparison for fans who'd used public transportation after matches let out, with several describing feeling more comfortable on late-night trains and buses in certain host cities than they'd expected, while others were more candid about avoiding public transit late at night in a couple of specific cities where they'd received local advice to stick to rideshares instead. That mixed picture is worth including honestly, since not every host city or every hour of the day produced the same reaction, but the overall balance of reports leaned heavily toward pleasant surprise rather than confirmation of the more alarming expectations many fans had arrived with. By the time these fans started boarding flights back to Europe, South America, Africa, and beyond, a specific pattern had formed across a huge number of unrelated travel accounts. Genuine surprise at just how far the actual experience had diverged from what they'd expected walking in. That gap showed up across nearly every category: the warmth of ordinary interactions, the scale and polish of the stadiums, the quality of food in cities they'd never have specifically chosen to visit for cuisine, and a level of everyday safety that directly contradicted years of accumulated media impressions. A number of fans described feeling a little embarrassed looking back at their own pre-trip assumptions, admitting in follow-up posts that they'd absorbed a fairly one-sided negative picture of the country without ever really questioning where that picture had come from in the first place. That kind of public self-correction, hundreds of individual travelers essentially admitting they'd gotten it wrong, is part of what gave this particular wave of tournament commentary more staying power online than the usual round of post-tournament travel content. Whether that shift in perception holds up over time or fades the way a lot of holiday enthusiasm eventually does, the sheer volume and consistency of these specific, detailed reactions made this tournament stand out as a genuine moment of reassessment for a huge number of people who came in with one set of expectations and left with something considerably different. A number of sports journalists and travel writers who cover major tournaments regularly noted that this particular shift felt more pronounced than what they'd observed following previous host nations, pointing specifically to the volume of unprompted, detailed testimonials rather than the usual short, generic praise that tends to follow any large event regardless of location. Airlines and travel booking platforms reported a modest but noticeable uptick in return trip bookings to the United States in the weeks immediately following the tournament, with a portion of that traffic coming specifically from fans who'd only originally planned a single visit tied to the football itself. Whether that translates into a lasting shift in how the country is generally perceived across the countries these fans came from, or simply fades as a pleasant memory from one specific summer, is something that will likely only become clear over the next year or two as tourism and cultural data from this period gets fully analyzed. What's already clear, though, is that for the specific group of people who made this trip, the gap between expectation and reality was wide enough and consistent enough across an enormous number of individual accounts to genuinely count as one of the more talked about outcomes of the entire tournament. So out of everything covered here, the welcome, the stadiums, the food, or the safety, which one do you think would have surprised you the most walking in with the usual assumptions? Let us know in the comments, and if you made this trip yourself, we'd genuinely like to hear which part of it matched or didn't match what you expected. If you enjoyed this breakdown, hit like and subscribe so you catch the next one. This video is compiled from traveler accounts, public reporting, and general information for entertainment and discussion purposes, and it isn't meant to represent every city, every fan, or every experience from this tournament.